Hi, everybody. So I'm super excited. As you can tell, one, I've had coffee, but two, I get to dive into one of my favorite topics with you guys. So this is my first official lecture. For those of you who have not had me in class before, please note that in our module, I have placed a document entitled Module 1 Handout. Now, these handouts are your golden ticket to studying for the quizzes and the exams specifically, and you should be asking, why? Why are they the golden ticket? They're the golden ticket because you, as you watch this amazing presentation, this incredible lecture, will fill in the blanks when you see a word or concept highlighted or placed in red. And I'll point you to those important terms when we get to them throughout the lecture, but you'll fill it in and then keep those handouts because as you prepare for the quiz or the exam, guess what? You'll already have your study guide. Isn't that amazing? All right, so without further ado, today we're going to talk about first and foremost, how did we get the court system that we have today? It would be a disservice to you, and I should be fired as a professor if I just dove into courts without explaining where the heck they came from. Why do we have a court system? How are they structured? Where does their power, their authority come from, right? So that's what today's lecture is all about. I promise you I will not talk too long. All right. So how did it all begin? How did we have what we have today, which is a democracy that has a separation of powers between the legislature, the judiciary, and of course, who? Dun, 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 the executive, the president. How did we get that cool little system that's in place? Well, the origins began with the fact that our Constitution, that beautiful document that outlines our structure as a government, as a society, it's actually the oldest surviving constitution in the world. Now, I want you to pause and think about that. The United States is young. We're like little babies, little bitty babies, compared to other countries such as Germany, France. I mean, the list goes on and on. Greece. We are infants compared to those ancient civilizations which stem back thousands of years, right? But yet, we can claim that our constitutional document is the oldest surviving one. And the question you should be asking right now is why? Why has it survived so long? Why is it kind of like, and if you're a horror movie buff, why is it kind of like Jason, who always comes back from the dead and never dies? Well, not that our Constitution is a horror movie, because it's not, but it has survived many different trials and tribulations. And specifically, it all began in our 13 colonies. Before the Revolutionary War, which, spoiler alert, we won, there was only 13 colonies. And these 13 colonies were considered inferior. And Great Britain kind of looked at the American colonies as, oh, that's cute. They're cute. But no matter what the people achieved, what they created, what they maintained in the colonies, they were never going to be looked at as anything more than insignificant provincials. Because remember, Great Britain was what? A monarchy, meaning they had a dun 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 dun, a king. So it didn't matter if somebody invented a printing press. It didn't matter if somebody knew 18 languages, because they were never going to be of the social status of a monarchy. You understand what I'm saying? So the American colonies were not revered as anything. They were kind of just there. Now, if it weren't for three mistakes that Great Britain made, we would arguably still be bowing before a king. And you may say, what? I hope y'all are all saying that. If it weren't for Great Britain's three big mistakes, which the first one, and you notice it's in what color? Red. So you should be filling that sucker in, okay? So the first big mistake that Great Britain made was King George in Great Britain instituted what was known as the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act isn't literally like a stamp on an envelope. That's not what it was indicating. A Stamp Act was a tax, and he started to tax things that arguably he probably didn't think a lot about what the repercussions were going to be, because he instituted a massive tax on legal papers, on playing cards, and tea. Now, wait a minute. You should be saying, like, what? Why are those such a big deal? Well, who uses legal paper? Lawyers. So you're going to piss off lawyers? And then who uses playing cards? Well, at that time, it was sailors. So you're going to piss off a bunch of sailors and attorneys. And then he pissed off the elite of the American colonies, because then he was instituting this massive tax on tea. So imagine, to put it in current context, it would be the equivalent of, I'm trying to think of something very popular today. Let's say TikTok. Most people use or on TikTok or some type of social platform. What if they taxed you for every time that you got on your social platform? What if they taxed you $10 for every time you logged in? How do you think people would react to that? The hair on fire, the world's ending, pitchforks in hand. People would be mighty upset, right? So you can sympathize with the colonists at this time period, because when that happened, they were like, whoa, pump the brakes. Now we're getting taxed this much on all of this. And here's the kicker. The taxes did not go back into building their infrastructure. It didn't help to rebuild their roads. It didn't help to build buildings. It went back to who? Well, King George, of course. And so they were very upset. And so all of you know the next story. All of you do. I know you do, because it's a story that everybody hears while they're in elementary school, but there's important details that are left out, like there is in most historical accounts, specifically the Boston Tea Party. Now, when the ships would come into harbor, our colonies would accept those goods after paying a tax. Well, when the tea was taxed and colonists were not happy, they did indeed dress up as Mohawk Indians. They went onto the ship at night. But this is the difference in terms of historical accounts. I bet you learned that when they went on that ship, they were like, woo, and they dumped the tea off, and it was really dramatic. And they're like, yeah, screw you, King George. That's not how it happened. Diary accounts indicate that they were actually very quiet. They didn't want to make a ruckus, because if they did, they knew it would take away from their message. If they acted like yahoos, then the king could say, look at those savage colonists acting like, pedestrians. Poor people. So they wanted to make it as non-affair as possible, making the message instead about the simple dumping of the tea. And they didn't throw it off and make a dramatic show of it. Instead, it was very anticlimactic, really, because they just went plop, 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 and the tea bags went into the sea. Now, they were so serious about their message being that they did not want to be taxed by the king at such high levels, that one of them, and there's always one in a group, right? There's always one. He stole some of the tea, and his fellow protesters were so mad at him. And this is in Boston in winter, by the way. They stripped him naked and made him walk home. Now, can you imagine that long, cold walk home? Nonetheless, when King George heard about this, he was furious. He stomped his royal feet and was in a huff and a puff and was not a happy camper. Now, this is actually a actual image of one of the Stamp Act's taxes. That's what it looked like. So he instituted what was called the Declaratory Act. Now, another way to say to understand what the Declaratory Act is, it allowed the king, King George, to declare anything he wanted, which of course he could do because he was king, but he was basically putting his thumb in the eyes of the colonists saying, hey, guess what? I'm king and I can do what I want. So they weren't very happy with that. Now, at this point, the colonists were involved in skirmishes with British soldiers, but what really was the kicker, the third dumb, horrible mistake that was made by Great Britain, was King George was very upset because one individual in particular who came from Great Britain to the Americas to collect the tax, the people were so enraged that they pulled him off the boat. And this is kind of graphic, guys. I apologize. I didn't do it. I'm just relaying history to you. They stripped him down naked, which seems to be a theme, right? In that time period, they're like, you did something wrong, naked. So they stripped him down naked, covered him in tar, drug him through the streets. And basically, John Adams, who you should know was one of our founding fathers, his diary accounts say that it was absolutely grotesque because there's slabs of his flesh coming off in the streets, right? Yikes. And then they sent him back to Great Britain. So King George gets this body that's been ravaged and he is not happy. So he instituted the Coercive Act, which that was at the point where he went to the different port cities and stopped anything from coming in. So think about that. This is a colonist-based collection of colonies, of communities, and they were no longer able to receive items, right? And so he cut off their supply chain. And this is called coercive act officially, but the people would refer to it as the intolerable act because they said, this is just intolerable, right? Now, the fourth one is the murder act, but it's not considered one of the big three. But I did want to include it because this is the point in which he gave permission to any and all soldiers to kill anyone indiscriminately if they went against the word of the king. So that was a very vague permission, right? So it gave them broad permission to act basically like yahoos. Now, let me move my head. King George said of the Declaratory Act, I say, I can pass any law on you lots, and there's not a thing you can do about it. He sounds fun, doesn't he? All right. So we went to the Revolutionary War. We, again, spoiler alert, we beat Great Britain, and now we're free. But did that solve everything? The answer is absolutely not. We are not united as a nation. There's nothing united about the United States after the Revolutionary War. We're actually quite divided. In fact, when we say Civil War, we often think of the more well-known Civil War between the North and the South, right? But before that was even a twinkle in the eyes of our nation, there's actually almost a civil war that broke out between Pennsylvania and Connecticut because Pennsylvania and Connecticut were charging one another varying rates for importing goods. Now, think about that. That would be like Texas telling Louisiana, hey, anything that crosses into our state from your state, you have to pay $20 per item. That's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, right? So it led to a lot of skirmishes during that time period. Plus the fact the colonies had different forms of currency. Some colonies had pounds, some had pesos, some had different like Spanish currency. So it was all over the place. There, again, nothing united. But here's the most important element that did unite us. We were broke. War is expensive. It is not cheap to fight a war. And so as a result of being broke as a joke, they needed money because at that time, all we had was an Articles of Confederation, which an Articles of Confederation, and excuse my language, but it sucked because it didn't require the people to put any skin in the game, meaning it asked people to pay taxes, but it didn't require them to. So think about that. That would be akin to our federal government today saying, hey, if you want to pay a tax on that, you can, but you don't have to. How many people would pay a tax? I know I wouldn't. I'd be like, woo, I'm not paying a thing. So we were not united, broke, and we didn't know what kind of government we really wanted. In fact, George Washington could have been our first king. Yes, you heard me right. We could have been bowing down to another King George, George Washington. The story goes that one of his military leaders actually wrote him a letter suggesting that he become king because he was well respected. He was considered a leader, and he helped guide soldiers throughout the Revolutionary War as a general, albeit not successfully all the time. But again, he was well regarded. And George Washington did something that I don't think a lot of people could do, which was he denied the power. He said, I don't want it. I don't want to be king. We've already had a King George. Didn't go so well. I don't want to be another King George. So that reverberated over time and made waves throughout the world. In fact, Napoleon, who tried to take over the world on his deathbed, his very last words were, and they wanted me to be another Washington. Now think about that. What he's saying is Napoleon could never renounce power. He just grabbed. He wanted as much power as his little heart could take. But George Washington is able to do something again that not a lot of people could do. So he set the stage for the founding fathers getting together in Philadelphia to originally just tweak the Articles of Confederation. Now, I want you to really think about that. There was nobody in that room when they first went in that thought, let's form a whole new form of democracy. Let's scrap this thing and let's just do something crazy. No, that wasn't a twinkle in any of their eyes. Again, they were going originally to amend, to tweak the Articles of Confederation. And it wasn't until two individuals that this changed, including Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. James Madison is often overlooked in history, and he should be revered quite a bit, especially in our national history, because if it weren't for him, arguably we would not have a United States Constitution. He's the one that consistently suggested that they should scrap that and instead move toward a new form of democracy, right? And what's funny about Madison is that history tells us that he was very quiet. He wasn't a loud man. He was very soft-spoken, and that annoyed his fellow founding fathers, right? They were like, speak up, man. And luckily his buddy was Alexander Hamilton, who was a talker, right? So with Alexander Hamilton's help, they pitched it and they won, and they were able to start the talks and creating a new form of government. Now, this is the kicker. We today put our founding fathers on pedestals, right? We're like, oh, heaven sing part. We think they're amazing. And they were smart cookies, right? But at the time, they were not trusted, because the very first thing that they did was made all the proceedings within that small room in Philadelphia 100% secret. So can you imagine if tomorrow our government were to say, no C-SPAN, no cameras, no transcripts, no recording. We're going to scrap this whole form of government that we have. We're going to do something different, but we'll tell you about it when we agree on it. That would be like your Twitter feed or whatever social media feed you may have would be on fire. People would be going crazy, right? So again, that saying, I smell a rat, it came from this time period in our history, because Patrick O'Henry, one of the colonists, said, I smell a rat, when they made all the proceedings secret. So again, think about that context. The people didn't trust the founding fathers because we had just experienced a monarchy, a king, and they were terrified that these founding fathers were just recreating a new king in different clothes, right? So Abraham Lincoln has a quote that I love. He says, we the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution. Meaning this document that we have, it is the oldest surviving document for a reason, guys. It has survived trials and tribulations in our nation's history because it is well thought out, and it gives voice to the voiceless, and it divides power, which is extremely important, right? So ultimately, the original Constitution, and what you should be asking is, what do you mean original? I'll get to that. The original Constitution had 7 parts, a preamble, meaning like an introduction, and 6 articles. That was it. And when the founding fathers came to the colonists, they had to get them to approve it. And every single one was like, nope, nope, not just no, but hell no. And the reason why they were basically all saying no and feeling uncomfortable with it is because these original articles specified the rights of the federal government. It didn't give basically any rights to who? Us, the people, right? And so the only reason why we have a constitution today is because the founding fathers promised, and they fulfilled their promise, that they would put in place the Bill of Rights within 3 years. So in 1788, the original Constitution was born and introduced to the people, but it wasn't until 3 years later that the Bill of Rights was incorporated and fully accepted as our official United States Constitution. Now, in terms of, let me hide my face, in terms of the articles, right? The 6 articles, this is a map. If you want to know what Congress can and can't do, what article would you look at? Article 1. If you want to know what the president can or cannot do, what article do you look at? Article 2. If you want to know anything about the courts, where do you look? Well, Article 3. So we have 3 branches of government, 3 articles that specify each of these branches of government's power, authority, and limitations, okay? Now, this is important, and notice that it's highlighted in yellow, which means that you should be filling this in on your handout. The United States Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, has what's known as the Supremacy Clause. Now, the Supremacy Clause declares that the Constitution is, in fact, the supreme law of the land, meaning that if anything comes in conflict with what's set in stone in the Constitution, who wins? Constitution. Other one, they lose. They get knocked out, right? Like this GIF shows, Muhammad Ali. So think of the Supremacy Clause as Muhammad Ali. It's going to knock the hell out anything that comes into conflict with it. So if Texas says, you know what, we're not going to allow our citizens to say the word blue, the United States Constitution is going to say, you know what, Texas, I think you should rethink that, because our First Amendment of the United States Constitution says that you have freedom of speech. So, you lose. You see how that works? So this is the kicker, though. How did it become a supreme law of the land? And who has the final word? Who says it's the final word? Who resolves those conflicts? Well, in Article 3, which specifies what branch? The court. That'd make a great test question, wouldn't it? So Article 3 outlines the power and the limits of the courts, says that the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall, at stated times, receive of their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. Now, why did I read that long Article 3 paragraph? Well, does it say anything about what the Supreme Court does? What is their power? How many sit? Nope, sure doesn't. In fact, do you know the United States Constitution does not even require a United States Supreme Court judge to be a United States citizen? They don't have to be a citizen. They don't have to be a lawyer. That's not specified. That's not a requirement. We later have crafted that as, laissez-faire requirements, but it's not in the United States Constitution. So who and why do they have the last say? It's because of this amazing case. Now, are you ready for a roller coaster ride of a story? So Marbury versus Madison was on the cusp of one of the most contentious presidential elections in history. Now, we think, and rightly so, that the recent 10 years or so of our presidential debates have been a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, right? No matter what side of the aisle you're on, I don't care. But the point is that it has been a little crazy. But this one would make what's happened lately look like Disneyland. So during the debate between the presidential elected officials, or wanting to be elected officials, sorry, I haven't had enough coffee. You had John Adams, who was a staunch Federalist, which means that he believed that the federal government should have power and that this power should be shared with the states, but ultimately the federal government should have more power in a way. Whereas on the other side of this spectrum, oh, hold on, my phone's ringing. Hold on. Awful. Okay, sorry about that. So John Adams lost the presidency to Thomas Jefferson, who was a staunch anti-federalist. He was like, right, on federalism. So he believed in states' rights all the way. So you had two very polar opposite folks going against each other. And ultimately, again, Jefferson beat Adams. Now, Adams wasn't happy about that. So he did something that historically is looked at and called the Midnight Run, right? Which is before he walked out the door of the presidency, and a period of time in which we typically call the lame duck session, because typically a president, when they're on the way out, they don't do a lot, right? Typically. But John Adams, he's like, I'm going to nominate and create multiple courts, multiple judge appointmentships, and all of them I'm going to appoint Federalist judges. And that's what he did. He created multiple courts, named tons of federal judges. And back then, there was no email, there was no phone. So they had to send an individual on horseback to give out these appointments, right? So the story goes is that John Marshall, remember that name, he was Secretary of State at the time. And so he's riding his horse and he's handing out these appointments. You get an appointment, you get an appointment. Gets an appointment. But one very important person did not get his appointment. Poor Marbury. So Marbury didn't get his appointment. Why? Because John Marshall arguably did something that a lot of us probably have done, is he stopped over at a bar, and I bet his last words, infamous words, were, I'm just going to have one. Does anybody just have one when they go and they say that? No. So he tied one on too many and was not able to fulfill giving out the rest of the appointments, specifically to Marbury. So the next day, who comes into the office? It's Jefferson. And he sees these appointments. He's like, screw that, rip, 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 trash. And Marbury's like, wait a minute, I was supposed to get that. That's not fair. I got that from Adams, and you should respect the appointment that I got. Well, this is the kicker. One of the appointments that was made was to John Marshall. Do you remember that name? He's the one that rode on horseback giving out the appointments. Well, Adams made him Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So the very person who messed up is now ruling over the very case at which he caused the chaos. Now, today, we would call that a little bit of a conflict of interest. But being that this was basically the first real decision of the Supreme Court, they let things slide, right? So Chief John Marshall was proceeding over this case that he caused. And here's another kicker. His cousin was Thomas Jefferson, and they hated each other. In fact, when Marshall was giving Jefferson the oath of office, the story goes that he's whispering under his breath, like, I hate you. I hope you die. And Jefferson's like, I hope you die too, cousin. I am not a fan of you either. So there's a lot of soap opera drama going on behind the scenes as well. But this is the thing. John Marshall was very smart. I'm going to say that again. He was very smart because he knew that the United States Supreme Court had no delegated power under the United States Constitution. It doesn't say that they had the final word. It doesn't say that they have the authority to rule on constitutional conflicts of or issues. So he didn't want to ruffle his cousin's feathers too much, because if he did, Jefferson could have very easily said, screw the Supreme Court, I'll make another Supreme Court, right? And then cases would never end. So he had to walk a very fine line. So the story goes is that he took all the other justices and they went to a cabin in the woods to make this decision, and they drank tons of wine. Marshall was a drinker. In fact, he would tell his fellow justices while they were in the cabin debating this case of whether a new president had to acknowledge a appointment that was never fulfilled by a previous president. He would say, we can only drink when it rains, and our jurisdiction is so vast that it's raining somewhere. So they basically drank a lot. So I guess there's something to be said for wine is good for the heart and the legal mind. I don't know. But they ultimately ruled that no, Marbury doesn't get his appointment. Poor Marbury. And that's because they said we can't force. Our purview is to have the final word on constitutional conflicts. We cannot make a president do something, meaning that's not in our wheelhouse. The Constitution doesn't give us that right. That's in a separate branch. We have a separation of branches, and that's not on our branch. We're on a different branch of the tree. But they did create a very important concept called judicial review. This gives the Supreme Court the ability to say what the law is. I'm going to say that again. This gives them the ability to say what the law is. They are the final word. There's no one above them. Once you get to that courthouse door, end of game, that's it. Time's up. So it was a monumental achievement because they gave themselves authority. They created an endpoint, meaning if they hadn't done that, cases would go on forever, which would be a nightmare, but probably heaven for attorneys. So in essence, judicial review is the most important Supreme Court decision, because without it, we would never have had a Supreme Court ruling on any of the subsequent cases like Brown v. Board of Education and all the landmark cases that we now consider near and dear to our nation's heart, right? So judicial review is extremely important, and it was all born out of John Marshall's flub and saying, I'll just stay for one, right? So that is the first lecture. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'll put my head in front of Porky Pig. You have a discussion to do. You have some assignments to do. Please fulfill them by their due dates. And if you have any questions whatsoever, you can email me, you can text me, you can call me, you can come by my office. All those options are on the table. So I look forward to diving into these issues with you more, and I'll talk to you next week. Adios.